Could you identify a Tartarian building? Whether you're new or old to the Tartarian story, you're likely familiar with the idea that during the Middle Ages, the vast Tartar Empire covered most of the earth and left their mark with amazing architecture. After this empire fell, the usurpers of history took credit for these buildings. Now, many say that these elaborate buildings are revival architecture, and that this story is crazy. So, what's the true story behind this? We're going to dive deep today and give a detailed analysis and present History Hack's take on what exactly is and isn't Tartarian architecture. Could your small town have been home to the lost civilization known as Tartaria? You'll definitely want to stay tuned for this one. First off, if you're just joining History Hacked and you want to learn more about hidden history and Tartaria, subscribe to us on X at history_hacked. We're also at YouTube at History Hacked and Rumble and BitChute. You could also visit our website at historyhacked.com, where we have articles and videos that range from introductions for Tartaria novices to deep dive research. We have long form podcasts, short microdocs. It is great rabbit hole diving material. And if you like what we do and want to start some conversations, check out our Shop Tartaria store at historyhack.com/shop. We got some great Tartarian swag, and it's sure to get the conversation started. Now, with that said, let's get into what is Tartarian architecture. So if you're not familiar with Tartaria, there's this emerging field of research that claims that most of academic history is a cover-up to hide that places like Western Europe, China, the Americas were essentially part of a worldwide medieval empire. And if you want to understand what I'm saying, just picture what history would be like if the Byzantine, the Mongols, the medieval Russian, and essentially the precursor to the Ottoman Empire, and you could even throw in a bit of the Atlantean myth in there, was actually a large medieval superstate which controlled the world from Central Asia. And this superstate can be labeled under the blanket name Tartaria. Now, this might sound bonkers, but anyone who's looked into it even for a short amount of time can see that there's clearly mountains of evidence that this was indeed the case. I'm sure many of you watching this are already familiar. And there are many subsets in this Tartarian research. Our channel, History Hacked, for the most part adheres to and promotes Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko's research into the matter. Fomenko is a full member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and a department head of topological geometry at Moscow State University. And from the 1970s to the 90s, he led a team of researchers at Moscow State University to really suss out what our true history was. And he did this by analyzing statistical correlations found in old documents. Now, what he found kind of shocked the world and academia, and it really makes him the godfather of Tartarian research. And he's really one of the first academics to come forward with the claim that what we've been told about medieval Russia, the medieval Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde, was a cover-up job, and that this civilization we will refer to as Tartaria is the only historical empire that we know of. This empire is even what we think of as ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and even ancient Egypt. And medieval records were rewritten during the Reformation era to sort of give the impression of a mythical and ancient Europe that gets credit for kickstarting civilization, when in fact it was created in the East much later than what we've been told. And this false historical narrative was kind of written to hide any evidence that places like Italy, France, and England were once subordinate to this empire. Now, Fomenko has many critics, even in Tartaria research, with the most common accusation is that he's a Russian propagandist and that he credits Russia with everything. His critics kind of say that he promotes a form of Russian imperialism, but I've been reading his material for 5 or 6 years now, and I don't think he's a propagandist. It is truly impressive the scale of work that he's put out, and he tackles this subject from all angles, from astronomy, proving that ancient eclipses actually happened in medieval times, not ancient times. Another aspect he tackles are the zodiac walls on the ancient Egyptian temples. When you actually date these zodiacs based on what planets are in front of what constellations, it gives you a snapshot of when that zodiac was created. And Fomenko's research has determined that all of the Egyptian zodiacs were created in the era of the Middle Ages. Also uses statistical data extracted from old records to show that all ancient dynasties are copies of one another, with the rulers each having their duplicate in a different era and time, with similar events happening during their reign. So for me personally, Fomenko knocked it out of the park, and if you feel like deep diving, all his work is chronicled in the 8-part history, fiction, or science series. Each volume is like 600 pages of pure fire with over 1,500 cited sources. No one really comes close to the research that Fomenko has done, and for that reason, we're going to rely heavily on his reconstruction today to see exactly where this Tartar Empire was and where they were not, and also when they were there or not there. And there's a lot of people in the Tartaria truth community that don't even know or even disavow Fomenko's research, and I think that's why a lot of the story of Tartaria is kind of cloudy and vague. You can tell that there was something there. You could see the maps, you could see the documents, you could see the architectural thread that carries around the world. But Fomenko gives you a detailed account of this empire's formation, its expansion, and its ultimate destruction. And that's why we'll be using this as a template for sussing out Tartarian architecture where it shouldn't be. So let's kind of reconstruct history according to Fomenko when he believes the historical records first appeared, which is around the 1000s. According to Fomenko, this empire had really been in place before then, but there weren't really any historical records that reached our time from this. He claims that it was originally run out of Alexandria, and it's what we think as Ptolemaic Rome, and even a lot of the old Egyptian culture and practices comes from this time. I'm not saying that the new kingdoms of the pharaohs were from this time. Fomenko actually says that they came later. But there was a kingdom centered here in Egypt that controlled the Mediterranean, and it's all we kind of know. So eventually, as this empire grows, trade with the East becomes more important, and this capital moves to the shores of the Bosphorus near modern-day Istanbul in the late 1000s, early 1100s. And according to Fomenko, this capital on the Bosphorus was the template for ancient Troy and Gospel Jerusalem, with the Christ figure being Emperor Andronicus Komnenos I, and his execution triggering the sacking of Constantinople in 1204, which is the Fourth Crusade. But also Fomenko says this was the First Crusade, and instead of it happening in Jerusalem, it happened here near Constantinople, and it was a duplicate of the Fourth Crusade. Now, this empire controlled from the Bosphorus had many kingdoms. The most powerful one at the time was just across the Black Sea and was kind of known as the Scythians. Now, this area which they inhabited, which is north of the Black Sea along the Volga and Don rivers, was kind of the center of population and culture at the time. You could traverse this large area with an interconnected river network. It was basically a highway system. You can move soldiers and goods quickly. It was basically the breadbasket of the world and could support a large population. Essentially what they did is they slashed and burned these vast forests, and from that it created nutrient-dense soils which you could grow crops for a time being without having to do crop rotation. This was also rich in mineral resources, and because they had such vast forests, they could generate heat and smelt metal for weapons in greater quantities than anyone else. There's also vast areas of this region that are perfect for breeding horses, and horse culture played a powerful role in this empire's rise. You can kind of see how this area became powerful militarily and economically. As proof of that, we can just take a look at the Frau Moro map from 1450. This is sort of the tail end of this empire's expansion. So keep in mind, this is a European map made by a Venetian for a Portuguese king, and we have actually a detailed video specifically for this map. You could clearly see that Central Asia, coming out of the Dark Ages, was the center of civilization, and that Europe is pretty empty. Even Rome is just a pyramid, but it kind of backs up this historical scenario that I'm describing. So in the early 1200s, after this capital was sacked, this larger empire was in disarray. And the 12 kingdoms, there's 12 kingdoms from this Scythia area, and they were each ruled by members of the same kind of interconnected royal family. And it's the same family that the Jesus figure Andronicus Komnenos came from. So the capital near Istanbul was kind of a political capital, it was a commerce capital, and it was a religious capital. But this empire was really controlled by this royal family that lived in the north, along the Volga River pretty much. And this family and their relatives in the surrounding kingdoms formed an alliance, and they had the philosophy that the whole world belonged to them, both all known and all yet to be discovered lands. So after this capital in the Bosphorus was sacked, certain areas in the empire were in disarray. Many declared themselves independent, which was a big no-no to this royal faction of kingdoms in Scythia. So alliance of these 12 kingdoms formed with a supreme Khan ruling from the Volga in Russia. But you also had dukes and kings from other kingdoms around the area. What happens next is kind of what you think of as the Mongolian Empire. However, this Mongolian Empire was not Mongolian in the sense of what we think of Mongolia today. It was made up and ruled mostly by Caucasian Russians. And if you look in the official history of the Mongol Empire, they tell you that the people from the steppes of Mongolia enslaved these entire Caucasian Russian kingdoms and made them their military slaves, utilizing their technology and their military prowess for their own advantage. When in reality, it was the opposite. It was the Russians that were the true Mongols. And the word Mongol doesn't even mean what it means today. Mongol simply meant great or many. The term Mogul, which we still use today, he's like a media mogul that derived from the word Mongol. The word Mongol didn't even describe people in modern-day Mongolia until the 1700s. One thing to understand is when you think Mongol, don't think East Asia, although they were part of the Mongols. You have to kind of look at it as occurring more in the West. And we'll loosely refer to this kind of empire as Tartaria. Fomenko is kind of nitpicky about it. He says the Tartars were specifically the Kozak army in southern Russia, Kazan, Kazakhstan, which Kazakhstan literally means country of Cossacks, the Ukraine, the Golden Horde. And he refers to letters of these Russian royals where they referred to the Tartars as serving under them, and you kind of get the impression that they didn't consider themselves Tartars. So, in a detailed sense, Mongol meant the royals and the nobles, and the Tartars was one of the large horde armies that conquered from southern Russia. However, I think because this army was the largest and most successful of the horde armies, the whole region gets referred to as Tartaria. And you definitely see this in later maps from the 1700s where this whole region is called Tartaria. And if you talk to a mainstream historian, they'll basically tell you that Tartar and Mongol are kind of interchangeable. So for the sake of argument, we're just going to refer to everything as Tartaria today. So once this gigantic alliance of Scythian armies is formed, they're ready to conquer the world, or reconquer it as they saw it, as these royals thought it was always their world to begin with. And as this invasion kicks off, this is where it really devolves from mainstream history and becomes kind of Fomenko's story here. So under this now Russian Genghis Khan figure, these Tartar armies conquer not only Asia, but all the way across Europe into England and Ireland between the late 1200s and early 1400s. Julius Caesar is basically a fictional duplicate of this Genghis Khan figure. And a lot of the stories of Caesar conquering the Gauls, conquering the Germanic tribes in Northern Europe are duplicates of this Mongol/Tartar march across Europe, and thus creating a Romaic Empire. And this was kind of written out of history because elites in the West during the Renaissance did not want to admit to their population that they were once subject to an Eastern Khan. They wanted to have their population believe that they were always in power. So that's kind of a reason why this was edited out, or at least pushed back in time and given a Eurocentric makeover. So in terms of architecture, this is where we get our first stamp of what I would say Tartarian architecture across Europe. They settled in Italy and built the Vatican. The Vatican, it literally means Batu Khan, and that's where sort of Genghis' associate settled and died there at the Vatican. They built the Gothic cathedrals, and some of these Tartar armies were Germanic, so you get a heavy German influence in certain places. But Fomenko also states that a lot of what we see that we attribute to ancient Greece or Roman was this pagan Christian style that was popular in the 1200s when this large wave invasion occurred. If you look at it closely, you can really see this merger of what we think of as both ancient and medieval. It's kind of a blurred line, even though these eras are supposed to be separated by 1,000 years. So the great cities of Europe were really founded at this time in the late 12, early 1300s. Now, whether any architecture that came from the wake of this invasion is Tartarian isn't that hard to figure out for me. You would just kind of have to argue with the historian whether or not Europe paid tribute to the Khan during the Middle Ages, and whether something was, built by Tartarian invaders that colonized the land, or it was just construction of the local people who lived under the Tartars. It's kind of a little gray area. But in the sense, in Europe, Western Europe, you could say that anything built before the Reformation was Tartarian, in a kind of loose sense. When things get a little more spicy and a little more interesting to me is when we look at North America, especially the western half, where we're told that anything ornate or Gothic or classical is just revival architecture built by wealthy businessmen in the 19th century. So proving this story wrong and unveiling how many small town squares, churches, universities, city halls, etc. of Middle America were actually old world Russian, Tartar, Mongol buildings. It's a very interesting narrative, and cracking this mystery open can really topple a lot of dominoes. So what does Fomenko say about the settlement of North America? So let's get back to our reconstruction. By the beginning of the 1400s, all of continental Europe and Asia was pretty much under the banner of this empire. They paid taxes and goods to the Khan. They sent soldiers to fight in his gigantic horde armies. They sent envoys and even asked him for permission to invade neighbors. So if you could just understand that the early history of the Holy Roman Empire is a fake duplicate explaining this empire in a way that is Eurocentric, you kind of get the picture of this system. So in the 1400s, this invasion force spread from places like Spain and Portugal and the Netherlands, all of them at the time Tartar strongholds. And they settled pretty much America from the Atlantic, going down the eastern seaboard into Mexico and South America. This Tartar invasion force, they settled the Gulf Coast, like I said, the entire eastern seaboard, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, taming the land and building cities under the banner of the Tartar Khan. And while this was going on in the 1400s, the Americas were also settled from the Pacific by various tribes of Tartars. Fomenko states that the famous Siberian explorer Yermak, the true story behind him is that he actually led an invasion force into Mexico and established the Aztec Empire, which was Tartarian. And you can see from this 1640 atlas that shows both Mexico City and Cusco, no conquistadors in sight, but no typically native structures. These have a very European look. Were these cities founded with a Eurasian influence from the beginning? And this whole thing about them being truly native, separated from the rest of civilization, just being a myth. So these Russian Tartars coming from the Pacific, they settled along the west coast and established kingdoms there, and theoretically building out cities, farms, factories, ports, plantations, churches, what have you. The same things they would build in the very heart of Tartaria. You also had Chinese Tartars, Turkic Mongol Tartars, also settling this area in the 1400s. I'll just bring this up. This is an Italian map from 1598 of the Tartar Empire. You have the Grand Duchy in Moscow, probably Ivan the Terrible, or one of the three czars that was combined to create the fictional persona of Ivan the Terrible. At least that's what Fomenko claims. But if you look at it, he's the ruler of it all, just as Fomenko's Russian-centric reconstruction claims. Everything east of the Don River and the Black Sea was Tartaria. And even as we get to the Pacific, we see that Japan and the west coast of the US are included within the Tartar Empire. And that's definitely the west coast. You have Baja California, you have the Sierra Nevadas, and it seems mapped and labeled with cities by the late 1500s. So here's another map confirming that. Here we have the west coast also included in Asia Tartaria. Now this one is interesting. This is the Urbano Monte map from 1587, I believe. And if you look right up here right in Canada or somewhere north, you see this inscription that reads, "Summer Training Camp of the Tartars." And again, you also have a bunch of cities. And there's also plenty of written sources which claim that the Americas were populated by the Tartars. This great book, American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West, critics say it's kind of BS, but it's got a lot of interesting things. And let's look at this title of this chapter here. Voyages and Shipping of the Mongol Tartars and Settlements of the West Coast of America. So he goes into how the West Coast was populated from Tartars from the West. Another blurb right here. There remains no doubt that the Mongol Tartars found their way from China to the west of America in shipping. You have a source right here that says Kublai Khan, the Tartarian monarch, after conquering China, sent a naval expedition for the purposes of subduing Japan, but that armament was cast away and never more heard of. And it's often been conjectured that some vessels may have found their way to American shores, a supposition that will explain traces of Tartar customs existing among the Mexicans at the time of the Spanish conquest. Another source stating that we must inquire from what Tartars are the Americans extracted, referring to the American Indians. We also have the story of Hochata. Hochata, the son of the 5th king of Tartary, following his father's bloody footsteps, Hochata himself marched victoriously into North America. Large Chinese vessels supposed to have been commanded by Christian Nestorians as officers as being more trustworthy and more expert in warlike maneuvers than the Mongol natives. This expedition by some means found their way from Japan Islands, which are west of North America in the north latitude of 35 degrees, to the coast of America at the same latitude. The land opposite at a place called, in the Mexican language, Culiacan, and you have the Can in the name, opposite of New California in a latitude of 35 degrees, which is about Northern California. So not only do you have sort of Chinese and Mongol people, but you have Christians making their way across the Pacific to America. And the receipts just keep piling on. Here's a map from 1540, less than 50 years from Columbus discovering Hispaniola. As you can see, the entire eastern seaboard is completely built out with medieval castles and cities. And what you see by 1585 with this map is that the continent is completely settled. And this is over 20 years before the English first arrived in Jamestown. So the first English colony was pretty late to the game as far as North America is concerned. Now, it's interesting that after Europe was cut off from the Tartars in the 1600s during the Reformation, they were essentially cut off from the west of America and the Pacific, and you can see that in the maps, where in the 1500s and early 1600s, the west coast was fairly mapped out accurately, but in later maps up until the late 1700s, you could see that California is an island and that anything north of it is just unknown lands. And that's because the Europeans lost access to this part of the world when they fractured from the Central Empire. So if that was the case, how did we end up in the world we are today, where 99% have no idea that this is how the planet was civilized? I'll just shortly summarize this empire's decline and cover-up. So in the 1500s, it was a time of fracturing of this empire, and various kingdoms of Europe declared their independence. Italy and France being among the first nations to succeed and write their own fake version of history, which removed their subordination to the Tartar Khan and promoted a fake antiquity narrative where Europe created the whole thing a long time ago. Now, Spain was one of the last holdouts and was loyal to the Tartar Empire for a little bit longer. But by the early 1600s, a series of costly wars with Europe and an internal coup led by the Romanovs kind of overthrow the Russian Khan, and this is when Europe gained independence. When that happened, Europe took ownership of these colonies on the east of America, but this empire in the 1600s was still largely intact and still the largest in the world. The capital had moved from Moscow to Tobolsk. This is kind of where we see Tartaria in the maps in the 16 and 1700s, just east of Russia, after it has fallen from a world-controlling empire. But even after losing Europe, they still had a firm foothold on the west coast of North America. So as the Spanish, as the Dutch, as the French were kind of colonizing the US in the 1700s, they kind of had to deal with the leftovers of these Tartars that were there. And a very interesting story comes from Coronado and his search for the 7 cities of gold. The richest of the cities that Coronado was trying to find was called the Kingdom of Quivera, who was ruled by an extremely wealthy king whose name was, I shit you not, Tartar Rex, which also could be looked at as Tartar Rex or Tartar King in Latin. So Coronado and his men were led to Quivera by a native guide, oddly named the Turk, and they ended up somewhere in Kansas where they obviously did not find anything. However, time and again, we see Quivera on 17th century maps as being the Pacific Northwest. And we even have this map, I think it's the Zeta map from the late 1700s, that identifies Quivera as San Francisco. And this kind of makes sense that the lost city of gold, we know of the mineral resources of this area, and California is even called the Golden State. So it alludes to some kind of connection right there. So this empire from east of Moscow to the west of America remained intact until 1775, when a historically obscure yet significant event occurred called Pugachev's Rebellion. Now, the official history will tell you that this was the Romanovs suppressing a massive peasant revolt in the east, but in reality it was the defeat of the final Tartar capital in Tobolsk, with the rest of the empire collapsing shortly after. And it was after this, for the first time, that Europeans on the east coast could settle the lands, could move west, and settle lands that were previously occupied by the Tartars. Fomenko brings up that it's no coincidence that the American Revolution happened in 1776, 1 year after Pugachev's rebellion, and he kind of reframes the American Revolution as the American colonists fighting the English for control over these yet-to-be conquered lands. The destruction of Tartaria was further compounded, I believe, in the years 1811, 1812, with a series of natural disasters and military campaigns designed to wipe out the remnants of this empire. You have Napoleon in Moscow, you have the War of 1812, and you have a brutal suppression of peasant uprisings all throughout South America. There was also natural disasters well documented, including the year without a summer in 1916 and the New Madrid earthquake, which caused the Mississippi River to run backwards and rang church bells in Boston. You also have the Mount Tambora eruption, and all of this kind of contributed to create I would say a worldwide great reset, if you will, where the elites who survived after the devastation had ended, they could tell any story they wanted. But even with that said, even with writing Tartaria out of the historical narrative, it was still more widely known in the 19th century. The idea that Tartary was a large empire and that it likely invaded North America was an idea that had not been completely eradicated in the 19th century, and there were still recent memories of Tartaria. And there's much literature of this time that speculates that the natives were part of this Tartar horde or professional military caste. You got a book called The Origin of the Red Men from 1852. It talks about the crossing of the Tartar hordes into America from the northeast part of Asia. So we have a reference here. Mr. Parsons, in his Remains of Japhet, entertains no doubt that the earliest Americans were a colony from Tartary. Now, I haven't sourced all these out yet. I just came across a lot of these in a short amount of time, but nothing is stopping you from finding these sources yourself. But I'm just trying to show you that there's a plethora of references of Native Americans being referred to as Tartars during this time. We got another blurb here. Having achieved this conquest, the Tartars and their descendants had probably a much harder task to perform. This was to subdue the more ferocious and warlike European colonists who had entrenched and fortified themselves in the country. After the arrival of the Tartars, or Indians as they're now called, in the particular parts they had settled themselves in along the region of the Atlantic. Another one here. As the Tartars have overrun China, so the Aztecs subdued Mexico. As the Huns and Alans desolated Italy, the surviving race in these terrible conflicts between different nations of the ancient native residents of North America is evidently that of the Tartars. The book, The Origin of the Indians, the Mohawks are about 500. Their speech, a dialect of the Tartars, as is also the Turkish tongue. Here we got a blurb from a 1873 article that says Long Island was dubbed American Tartary. Edward Briarwood advances the opinion that the New World was first populated by Tartars because America was always better populated on the side towards Asia than on that towards Europe. Second, because the genius of the Tartars and the American Indians, who are nomads and never applied themselves to any art, was similar and their color the same. And the third, because the fierce wild beasts in America, which we cannot suppose to have been transported by sea, could only have reached here by way of Tartary. So there's a lot about the natives coming here from Tartary, but not only was it the natives, which was the army, you had the royals, the representatives of the royal court, the kings, the dukes, the noblemen coming over as well. And this is kind of where I believe we get these sort of Tartar buildings in the West. It's quite a fantastic story, I'll admit, but what if we use this as a template to find Tartarian buildings in the places that they're not supposed to be? So going back to Fomenko's reconstruction, let's pop into the region that was the central important area of this empire, the Volga region. And let's see what Tartarian architecture really looks like. Now, I urge anyone who is interested to get on Google Earth and scout this region out for themselves. And I've been asked if Tartaria was greater than Rome, greater than Greece, then where is it? It's right here. This area is a graveyard to a magnificent lost civilization. Look at these constructions. You have the classical style, you have the Romanesque style, you have styles that are stereotypical Russian. This type of building graveyard is completely unprecedented in the world, in scale and quality of the construction, and it corresponds perfectly to Fomenko's reconstruction. It's exactly what you would expect for the ruins of a lost, advanced medieval civilization that Tartaria was. Now, I mean, I would love to buy one of these things and rehab them. Just look at the quality of this construction. Now, a lot of these are out in the middle of nowhere, but if we go to these small towns in the region, we see more stunning stuff. Some of it's in pretty bad shape now, but you can argue that the quality of this matches or even surpasses some of the best architecture in Europe. And they're out here among these small villages in Ukraine and southern Russia. Now, we can look closely at the details of these buildings and see commonalities that we could then apply to buildings that we suspect are Tartarian. I mean, really soak in what we're looking at here. Picture these buildings stripped down to their basic structure and what they would look like if they were rehabbed by Americans in the 19th century. Maybe a new roof, maybe a new dome, stone facades added, features added that would make them look a little more Greco-Roman and less Slavic. But build a mental picture here of what I'm showing you and what that would look like. Ingrain these details in your subconscious because they will be important later. So what are the common techniques used here? Well, first off, obviously they used red brick and a layer of concrete plaster giving appearance of a stone facade. Now, red brick, people just kind of look past it, but red brick I find quite interesting because it's just everywhere universally. No matter their architectural style, no matter if it's a structure that is claimed to have been built 2,000 years ago or built in the 1800s, it's the same common red brick. And we see this simple brick everywhere, all over the world. The world supposedly separated and lacked basic knowledge of their neighbors, all settled on this brick color and proportion. But notice not just the brick material, but the proportions of these buildings, the thickness of the walls, the spacings of the windows, and how they are structurally reinforced. We get these metal rods embedded directly into the brick, and it's this kind of strange rebar. So this is a very specific type of construction. And if we go into America in the late 1800s, when it's supposedly robber barons building all this grand stuff, we do see similar styles, but key differences in the building technique. Let's take the Biltmore Mansion, for example, which often gets slumped into being Old World Tartarian, which I just looked at for 2 seconds and could tell that it wasn't, but you could see that there's plenty of construction photos where you see stone blocks. They're not using this brick with concrete plaster technique. Same thing with the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City. A lot of construction photos, we see that these are stone blocks being laid one at a time, as you would expect. And a lot of these buildings that are claimed to be Tartarian are basically modern steel buildings with stone facades. And I would say most of what we see in America, Old World America, is not Tartarian. It is revival, and you could kind of just tell by looking at how it was built. But if they were built just like they were in the Volga River Valley, the heart of Tartaria, then I think we can make a case for it being a genuine old world building that had its identity laundered by a fake narrative. So if we assume that the nobles of Tartaria built like this in the Volga, let's say they had the skill and the desire for a certain aesthetic, and they were then sent to the distant colonies, let's say in California, wouldn't they probably build in the same way? So let's say these buildings existed in the west of the United States and were abandoned after 1775 or 1812. You can kind of see how in California, Nevada, Utah, they could be easily remodeled and reoccupied to resemble what we see in the 1800s. Now, I want to make my position clear. I do not think that all or even the majority are of Tartarian origin. I wholeheartedly believe that revival architecture did exist, and that men from our civilization and our recent history did build extraordinary things. So you have to understand, we've been screwed by the Federal Reserve and tax system for the past 100 years. And I think we forget how much wealth there was in the 19th century to go the extra mile and do elaborate and beautiful flourishes and designs that we wouldn't do today. Central banking and debt slavery has really sucked the wealth for over 100 years, and I think that's why we've seen a decline in beautiful excess that people were able to afford prior to World War I. I think we tend to forget that even after Tartaria, with our own forefathers, that in itself is sort of a lost civilization. And we have a lot of construction photos, such as the Mormon Temple, as I mentioned, the Tabernacle, and you could say these are faked, and yes, there are, for sure, 19th century equivalents of bad Photoshop. But for general purposes here, I'm going to go that if I can't tell if a particular 19th century photo is faked, I'm going to assume it's real, because I'm going to assume from all the bad examples that they couldn't just fake it convincingly. So if it's convincing, I will accept it for the sake of argument. So I hate to poo-poo on other researchers' pet theories on what is Tartarian and what's not. There's a lot of contention in this community about what's what, and I'm not hating on any theory, I'm just giving my 2 cents in, and I will say what I think. And you can correct me and let me know or recontextualize things. It's all part of the process. I just have not seen anyone do a deep dive on this from the Fomenko angle, and I wanted to throw some info out there. And I've done my own deep dives and looked at thousands of old photos and have my own theories. And I'm sure some of you will disagree with some aspects of this, and that's totally cool. I have no problem with that. As long as we're approaching this from the purpose of trying to find the truth, I'm happy. So let's do a quick Tartarian USA road trip. And I'll start with where the Fomenko verse claims is a hotbed of Tartarian activity, California. As you can see by this 1854 survey map, California was mostly uncharted by as late as the 1850s, so we're expecting by this time that not much human development in the lands here. Yet, by the time the first photos arrive in the years following, we see that some of this unknown land is pretty well built out. Now let's take a focus on San Francisco. There's a great website and resource called Old SF, where you could sort old San Francisco photos by date and location, and you could really see some rare ones of how the city looked in the 1800s. You could see large undeveloped hillsides and areas that would later become North Beach, Russian Hill, Nob Hill neighborhoods. And of course, San Francisco was not only destroyed in an earthquake and fire in 1906, but few people know that it was destroyed before that in 1850, before the city was even photographed. So there's really no evidence of what was here before. But you can see that this is a panorama from 1853, and the city looks pretty built out, so the fire wasn't a total destruction, I assume. As you could see, a lot of these buildings do match what you would think of as Western style frontier constructions that are definitely not old world. But we also get some interesting ones. Here's a photo from the same year, 1853. The city is brand new, and we're starting to get these classical style features on buildings that look kind of worn out, if you ask me. I also find it odd that on the old SF website, there are certain parts of the city, such as the Presidio and around City Hall, where photographs don't show up until about the 1880s. Whereas there are plenty of photographs from the 1850s and 60s in other areas of the city. I mean, maybe there's nothing going on, or maybe there was something going on in these parts of the city that we don't see until the 1880s. But that said, we still get some very intriguing photographs. This was Union Square, looking almost exactly like the small town Russian and Ukraine towns. Even the buildings look pretty worn out here when they should be brand new. But it's also hard to tell sometimes in old photographs, and I assume all this was destroyed in 1906. Here's this Church of St. Ignatius at Van Ness and Hayes. The photo's from 1880. And I wouldn't be surprised if that building on the right is a contemporary add-on, but this old cathedral-looking building is very interesting. I wonder if it's made of brick. And I'm kind of on the fence about this one. It could be that this is just the plans of the city hall that was never built. And here we see a construction photo. So something that looks very Tartarian, but being built with modern techniques. So you gotta keep your guard up. And you can see in the background, the rest of the city hall was missing its kind of roof. So at least we could verify that the top half of the original city hall was constructed later. Now this one is quite intriguing to me. This is called the Broderick Monument at the Laurel Hill Cemetery. Now you can see here, it looks like an ornate monument, probably for some wealthy person. But then we have photos. I guess they're from earlier. And you can see that this monument is bigger. It's got a whole other piece that's missing in the finished product. So what happened to the top here? And we also have this photo where you can see it way in the background. This thing's huge. So I'm curious if there's more to the story here. Let me know if you have any more information. But it's not just San Francisco that myself and other researchers find suspicious from the Tartaria perspective. It goes through the whole Bay Area. I mean, just look at San Jose in the 1800s. Amazing. Here's a building I believe is the third capital of California, located in Benicia. Not really impressive, but it does kind of adhere to what we've been seeing in Russia. Also, Berkeley. Berkeley is very interesting. Look what Berkeley looked like in the 1800s. And it kind of just goes to this continuing theme of early universities looking very Tartar at their very beginning. So, were a lot of these old buildings rolled up into universities. So if we go up to the North Bay into Mendocino and Sonoma counties, it gets weirder. This is not very surprising, as it's admitted that this was Russian territory at one time. The names are still largely there. When I lived up there, I lived outside a small town called Sebastopol, and I kept on wanting to pronounce it Sebastopol, but no one else did. There's a large river flowing through Sonoma County that's even called the Russian River, and we're told that the Russian presence was limited, like to this one fort, Fort Ross. I've actually been there a few times. It's a state park, nothing remarkable. You have this small town of Ukiah, which I've been to. It's a nice place, but very tiny. And look what was there before. Like what? Here's the county courthouse in Ukiah. Here you have the collapsed Santa Rosa courthouse. And look, you can see that's brick with facade. Very similar. Not dead proof, but suspicious. But I also believe the Central Valley of California was settled. It's one of the most fertile regions in the world, and any civilization that made it to California would probably settle and farm in the Central Valley. Sacramento, the state capital, I believe was a built-out city prior to Western Americans arriving. And here's the Blessed Sacrament in Sacramento, believed to have been built between 1887-89. Despite being an era where photography became more common, we still don't have any construction photos of this. Here it is, basically brand new, but looking a little rough. It's not proof, and if you really want to shut me up about this, just send me some construction photos because I cannot find them. Also, look at this winery outside of Sacramento. Very interesting. I wonder if that is red brick as well. Now, I don't think the state capital of California is an old world building, but this is a construction photo that shows the base layer, and what we see is red brick, just like our Russian counterpart. So was the part of the Capitol built on something older, or was an older part incorporated? I'm not sure, but I don't believe the whole thing was just made out of brick. Now, this one I find surprising. This is Fresno, California. Now, if you've been to Fresno, it's a dump. The downtown looks like Bosnia in the 90s. It's kind of post-apocalyptic. So I find it very interesting to see how it looked in the past. Here's the Fresno Courthouse, a photo from 1890. And also looks a little mud-flooded if you look at those bottom windows there. Wonder if it's got a 2-story basement. I mean, look at this stuff. It's amazing. Here's a mission in Santa Clara, which later became Santa Clara College. And I wonder if that is red brick underneath that as well. In Mission San Juan Capistrano, a very famous mission in California. Under layers of this kind of primitive rock construction, we can see the base, i.e. the oldest layer of this chapel is good old red brick. Interesting. And going back to Quivira and these legends of these lost kingdoms in America that were rich in things like gold and silver, I think there's a strong case that the Tartars and Russians were into the vast mineral wealth of the American West, and that's where these legends originate from. Now, I got to spend some time in the Reno, Carson Valley area. The famous Comstock lode is not too far from here, and I noticed a few of the buildings that triggered my spidey sense and fit some of the criteria that we see in these abandoned Russian examples. One is Morale Hall at the University of Nevada, Reno. The other is called Lincoln Hall on the university. You can see Lincoln Hall right there, Morale Hall there. It's brick construction, obviously older than anything around, as it's the first things there, with large proportions, which is also a common theme. So was this a Tartar farmhouse or something? It just sticks out like a sore thumb, doesn't it? And there are a couple buildings in the Reno Carson area that I thought were interesting. One is the Reno Train Depot, which is now a gastropub. Classic brick building, stands out. And also what stands out is the State Capitol building in Carson. Again, no construction photos, and it just has this presence and really sticks out from everything around it. And I think there's a couple buildings on the block that do the same as well. One, I think, is a museum. We're going to go east from Reno and Carson to the next area that was potentially habited is Utah and the Salt Lake City area. I think the whole story with the Mormons and their pilgrimage to Utah, there's a lot to unpack here. And we also have maps from the 1500s, less than 100 years after Columbus. And Utah is already built out with cities. I think this is Brigham Young University in Provo. I mean, just look at that. And that building's still there, and it is made of red brick. If I'm not mistaken, it looks like it's mud flooded on the first floor, and that is not the original intended basement. So again, you have to wonder if there's a basement below the basement. Now, I don't think the Mormon temple is Tartarian. There are plenty of photos of that I would not say anything about them was fake. Same with the tabernacle. But speaking of fakes, we do have one with the Mormons right here. I think we caught them red-handed. I think this was the original Mormon temple in Salt Lake City. I'm not sure. This photo is hard to find sources for. And I don't even know this temple is still there, but you can see during the construction, it's an obvious fake. You have the edges of the top of the temple that are clearly cut out badly, I might add, from the sky background. It's an obvious composite, and you can even look and see these little guys right here. I mean, come on. So if this was the state of photographic fakery at the time, you can see why I'm inclined to believe photos that don't look like this may be real. I just don't think they could do a good job. So what I think is going on here is that they took a photo while they were renovating this old building. Red brick once again. What I think is happening is the photo with the original top was too different than the completed version and kind of would arise suspicions of someone, likely a Freemason, took the photo of the completed portion and crudely pasted it on top of the original photo. Here's a photo of the same church from a different angle, and you can see it looks like two different proportions of buildings. It looks like the first photo, the fake, is missing a floor. I don't know, maybe these are real guys on top. Maybe they got a little better with the cutout, a little more precise X-Acto knives or something. There is a definitely different proportion, and this photo is for sure fake. Similar temple here in St. George, more in the south. And I would say that these constructions that I've shown you so far were by Tartars that came from the west, from the Pacific. But like I said, US and Canada was settled from the Atlantic and made their way inland via the Great Lakes and settling the region. Probably about 200 or 300 years before Americans arrived on the scene. Chicago is a suspicious area. On the early maps, it's called Chilaga. And this is what the city hall looked like in 1837. Here's a view of what the city looked like in 1844. They had all these great buildings, but they got their first fire department after these were built. Now this is another old city hall. Looks very interesting to me. Same proportions as the old world techniques. And it looks like it had some wings added later. As you can see, that is something you see in common with these buildings. You have an older central building, then you'll have these large wings that are added later that try to match the style, but they don't quite match. And they contain little details that give away that it's modern. Here you can see that they try to make the wings look close, even added ornamentation. But you can still tell it's a different style. And of course, all this was destroyed in a fire, like many other great cities. I believe these are the wings of the old city hall that survived. I do not see the original building. Also, go a little bit north and you'll find Milwaukee is a hotbed of interesting stuff. Just get a load of this old city hall. Ohio, another very interesting area. Let's take a look at Toledo. Beautiful. Canton, is that a red brick rehab? They don't even have to look that elaborate. A simple brick square might have belonged to the lost Tartar civilization. Here's the Canton Courthouse. Pretty amazing. Erie County Courthouse. And here's the same building in modern times. Pretty sad. It's pretty sad that we do this to buildings. Here's Cincinnati checking in and looking mighty fine here. They were also on the Gulf Coast too. Here's a map from 1565 showing the Gulf Coast from Florida to Mexico pretty built out. And this church in Dallas looks exactly like the old world proportions we find back in Russia. I wouldn't be surprised at all to find out that it was red brick under that. Similar vibes with this one in Tulsa. Here's your average 1800s Texas firehouse. Completely on brand. Galveston is another area of interest. I think that was a hotbed. A lot of interesting buildings there. Now, as we go to the East Coast, it gets a little more difficult to tell because there are a lot of genuinely old buildings there, and Western civilization in its modern incarnation was there for much longer than on the West Coast. There's also much more revival architecture back east, which will lead to more false positives when trying to find Tartaria buildings. Back on the West Coast, it's just more obvious that there's something wrong with the story. That said, there's some notable East Coast anomalies. Here's an old insane asylum on Ward Island near New York City. Just amazing. Was the U.S. Capitol building originally Tartarian? Here you can see what the burnt out shell looked like after the War of 1812. And yes, that looks like a red brick with a fake stone facade. I'm just saying, we're kind of on brand here. Now, what about the World's Fairs? You hear about the World's Fairs more than anything, and how these were events to launder the identity of these grand cities by saying they were constructed and destroyed hastily. So, what's the deal behind the World's Fairs? Well, I actually went hard on this when I first heard about this idea that they were laundering old structures under the guise of World's Fairs. And yes, these stories are amazing. In less than a year, a bunch of low-skilled laborers built something that looked like it belonged at the height of Renaissance civilization. And many have claimed that it's impossible to build something like this out of wood and plaster. But I hate to break it to you, most of them were. I looked up this, I went down this rabbit hole, and I looked up specific buildings in San Francisco in 1915, Chicago in 1893, St. Louis in 1904. I looked up the names of the different pavilions, dug into the archives, where there's plenty of photos of the construction and demolition of these gigantic World's Fair buildings that are often claimed to be old world. Kind of one faulty example I see all the time is the columns outside the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, built for the 1915 exposition. A lot of Tartaria researchers say that these are old world because they are solid and not made out of wood and plaster. Well, as it turns out, the original ones were made out of cheap materials, and the original was demolished and rebuilt in the 1960s. I think it's obvious that these aren't old structures. I wish a little more discernment would be used when making these specific claims. And there's also photos in the case of San Francisco and etchings of the area done decades before the World's Fair that show no buildings existing in the World's Fair site prior to 1915. I will bring this up. It's the Midwinter Fair 21 years before that in 1894. This was done in Golden Gate Park. Could these be originals? Or before the Federal Reserve, did Americans just have the money to blow on creating these elaborate facades? I could really see how both could be sort of true. That's not to say that all the World's Fairs were free of suspicion. The whole premise is widely bizarre, and I think there are genuinely suspicious buildings that are claimed to have been built for the World's Fair that might be old world. And looking at these photos, you do see some of these fair buildings that look genuinely old, like this stone castle from the St. Louis Fair. Looks like it's been there for quite a while. The German town from the Chicago World's Fair is also very interesting. This is the German building from the same fair. Now, what about the corn palaces? These get a lot of attention because they just seem nonsensical that a bunch of farmers from Iowa would build stuff like this. But I am leaning on them being later constructions. Some of the photos are high resolution, and if you look closely, you could see steel and wood, and they do look rather flimsy. It's a very interesting phenomena, though. And in this one, you could see two different castles built in the same area over different years. And you can just see how these towers are just hollow structures. So I would claim that these are not Tartarian, and people did just build this way for fun. Although this front building is a little suspect here. Anyway, that's all I got for today. I hope I provided a template that will help you do your own explorations. And if you think I'm dead wrong, let me know in the comments. And if you actually have links to construction photos for anything I claim is Tartarian, include those as well. I'm developing this as we go, and it kind of takes a village to figure this all out, but I do believe there's something there in what I presented today. This field is in a constant state of evolution, and I'm not claiming what I say is the gospel. So if you want to join in the conversation, leave a comment, subscribe, follow us at history_hack. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed watching, and stay tuned for the next one. Bye-bye.